The lights go down, the room goes quiet. Then, from the center of the floor, a machine comes to life. 4 meters tall, shaped like a dumbbell, and above you, on the dome 23 meters wide, the sky comes alive. Every planet, every constellation, the slow wheel of the Milky Way. For nearly 3 decades, that was the experience waiting for you at 90 Queen's Park. It drew hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. Generations of Toronto school children took their first look at the universe under that dome. But in 1995, it closed, and in 2026, the dome is coming down. What's hard to explain is everything that happened in between. 30 years in which Toronto had every opportunity to save this building, and it didn't. This is the story of the McLaughlin Planetarium. The idea of a Toronto planetarium is older than most people assume. The first proposals date back to 1944, but went nowhere for 2 decades. What changed the equation was a single phone call in 1964. The man behind it was Colonel Robert Samuel McLaughlin. McLaughlin built his fortune in Oshawa, founding the McLaughlin Motor Car Company in the early 20th century before merging it into General Motors of Canada. By the mid-1960s, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country and one of its most prolific philanthropists. McLaughlin had visited the Hayden Planetarium in New York, named after Charles Hayden, a friend and fellow industrialist, and seen what a city could do with a serious commitment to public science education. He wanted Toronto to have the same, so in November 1964, he announced a donation toward construction, plus an additional endowment to fund ongoing operations. The location couldn't be better, right beside the Royal Ontario Museum, or ROM, on a site donated by the University of Toronto. The operation would be responsibility of the ROM, with no commercial returns expected. The planetarium was, in the clearest possible sense, a gift to the city. Construction began in 1966. Architects Hugh Allward and George Gwynlock designed the building around its function, with 4 floors, a cylindrical base, an octagonal midsection, and a hemispherical concrete dome, with 23 meters in diameter, rising 25 meters from the ground. On October 26, 1968, the McLaughlin Planetarium held its opening gala. Colonel McLaughlin, then 93 years old, was there to see what his money had built. The building opened to the public a week later, on November 2nd, about 6 months before the Apollo 11 moon landing. Public appetite for space was at its peak. From the moment it opened, the McLaughlin Planetarium was something Toronto had not seen before, a place where the city could look up. The experience began before you reached the theater. The second floor housed the Astro Center, a gallery of museum-quality exhibits on astronomy and space exploration, the kind of hands-on encounter with science that school curricula of the era rarely provided. It was a preparation for what waited above, the Theater of the Stars, 340 reclining seats arranged in concentric rings beneath the dome, every one of them angled towards the sky. At the center of the theater floor stood the Zeiss projector. It was a 4-meter-long dumbbell-shaped object, with 29-inch diameter spheres attached at each end representing the night sky for the northern and southern hemispheres. Connecting the 2 spheres was a framework that held nearly 150 individual projectors, including those dedicated to the planets, the sun, and specific stars. The experience of lying back in that chair and watching the stars wheel overhead was, for many Torontonians, their first genuine encounter with the scale of the universe. Most visitors to the facility would have seen a 40 to 45 minute audio-visual show with a particular space-related topic. 2 types of shows were typically alternated on a daily basis, one aimed at families with young children and another aimed at older children and adults. By May 1972, 3.5 years after opening, 1 million visitors had passed through its doors. A significant portion of them were school children. For roughly 2 decades, a trip to the McLaughlin Planetarium was a fixture of the Toronto school experience in the way that few cultural institutions managed to become, a rite of passage for generations of students growing up in the city. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the planetarium found a second audience. The dome's projection system and sound infrastructure made it a natural venue for laser light shows synchronized to music, like Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, among others. These quickly became very popular events. A generation that had grown up on school trips came back now as teenagers and young adults for a different kind of experience under the same dome. Greg, who operated the laser show at the McLaughlin in the early 1980s, described the experience from the operator's booth.
It was exciting to perform a show, absolutely. The music that was being played, it looked like it was being created by the light. The light was an abstract expression of the music itself. It was a very, very impressive and enjoyable experience, and commonly reported was to say that I didn't know my mind could do that. That's really what we were going for as performers. We want the audience to experience that.
Greg documented his recollections on his YouTube channel, The Golden Age of Laser Shows, including footage of the laser shows that exist nowhere else. You can find his channel in the card above or in the description of the video. The shows were a commercial success at a time when the planetarium's core programming faced headwinds. From 1978 to 1982, major construction at the ROM disrupted access to the site, and attendance fell. But the laser shows sustained the institution through that period. And when the ROM reopened, the planetarium numbers recovered. By the early 1990s, it was drawing approximately 200,000 visitors a year, roughly 1/3 of ROM's total annual attendance, and was, by the account of ROM astronomer Ian McGregor, one of the few planetariums in North America turning a profit. But to the surprise of many, at the end of 1995, it closed. 4 months before the closure, on June 8, 1995, Mike Harries won a majority government in Ontario on a platform he called the Common Sense Revolution. The centerpiece was a promise to cut provincial spending fast. The ROM, as a provincially funded institution, was subject to cuts. The government directed the museum to find immediate reductions in its operating budget. The figure targeted was $600,000. The museum board decided its course of action. On November 5, 1995, ROM President Lindsay Sharp announced the closure of the planetarium. The official rationale was falling attendance and declining public interest in traditional planetarium programming. However, neither claim held up to scrutiny. Despite the harder times in the late 1970s and early 1980s, attendance and profits had rebounded in the early 1990s. The ROM moved quickly. The theater seating was removed, the exhibits dispersed, and the wiring stripped. The Zeiss projector was disconnected and later sold to York University for $1. Now, with an empty building, the ROM hired a development consultancy to determine what to do next. The most promising option was a deal with National Geographic, which was considering a chain of large format theaters. The planetarium's dome was a natural fit. The deal came close, but didn't materialize. After that, no replacement plan followed. For nearly 7 years, the McLaughlin Planetarium sat. The Children's Own Museum occupied the second floor briefly under a 3-year agreement beginning in 1998, bringing nearly 500,000 visitors through the building's door before ROM construction in 2002 forced the arrangement to end. After that, the building became storage space for ROM artifacts, a use that required no investment, generated no revenue, and committed the institution to nothing. Then, in 2004, the ROM moved to resolve the problem by monetizing it, proposing to demolish the planetarium and replace it with a 45-story luxury condominium tower to help fund the Lipskind Crystal expansion. The backlash was swift. The University of Toronto opposed a tower on the edge of its campus. Heritage advocates objected a luxury residential building on donated public land. The ROM withdrew the proposal in November 2005. 4 years later, in January 2009, the ROM announced it had sold the McLaughlin Planetarium to the University of Toronto for $22 million. It is worth sitting with that framing for a moment. The land the ROM sold in 2009 had originally been donated to the project in the 1960s so that a privately funded institution for public education with no expected commercial return could be built. 41 years later, the institution that had received that gift sold the site for $22 million to, ironically, the institution that had originally given the land away. Under U of T ownership, nothing really changed. The building remained storage for the museum. The university's initial plans were to demolish the planetarium to make way for new law and business faculty facilities, but were quietly shelved as priorities shifted. Then, in September 2014, U of T announced a revised proposal, a cultural complex on the site, replacing the planetarium with a new building to house multiple faculties and public programming space. At the same time, there is the heritage protection situation. A year before, in 2013, the planetarium was nominated for inclusion in the City of Toronto's Heritage Inventory. The process works like this. After nomination, the site may be selected for further investigation to then maybe be formally designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. Once under the Act, the city must give its consent for certain decisions, such as demolition. Despite being selected for further investigation, a final heritage preservation report for the planetarium couldn't be found. Then, in October 2020, the City of Toronto issued a notice of intention to designate under the Ontario Heritage Act the buildings at 80 and 84 Queen's Park, directly adjoining the planetarium site, but not the planetarium. In parallel, the Toronto Preservation Board, reviewing the U of T redevelopment application, recommended approving the demolition of the McLaughlin Planetarium on the grounds that its removal would improve sight lines between Falconer Hall and the ROM's south entrance. In June 2025, the University of Toronto announced the final form of the redevelopment, a 6-story building that would house U of T's School of Cities, a center for scholarship on the forces shaping urban life. Demolition of the McLaughlin Planetarium started in spring 2026 and is expected to be completed by early summer of the same year. The new U of T School of Cities building opening details were not yet announced by the university. Today, Toronto is the largest metropolitan area in North America without a planetarium. Other major Canadian cities, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Montreal, all have functioning planetariums. From 1995 to 2024, the Ontario Science Centre served as Toronto's de facto planetarium, operating a high-resolution digital theatre that was a fraction of what the McLaughlin offered. The Science Centre closed permanently in June 2024, and the planned redevelopment at Ontario Place does not include a planetarium. As of 2026, the closest functioning planetarium to Toronto is now the 35-seat McLaughlin at McMaster University in Hamilton. There have been efforts to build something new. Space Place Canada, a federally registered charity formed by former planetarium professionals and astronomy educators, has spent years advocating for a new public planetarium in Toronto. Their vision is a modern facility, digitally equipped, purpose-built for a city whose population has doubled since 1968. But the obstacles are significant. A new facility would require between $100 and $200 million in funding, an accessible footprint large enough to house a dome, exhibit space, and other facilities, and crucially, an institution willing to own and operate it. A 2022 NANA survey found that 74% of Ontarians support a new public planetarium, but no government, university, or cultural institution has stepped forward to build one. What happened to the McLaughlin Planetarium was the accumulated result of 30 years of institutional logic, each decision individually defensible, but collectively ruinous. The ROM closed it to satisfy a budget directive, then stripped it, stalled on it, and sold the land. The University of Toronto inherited a storage problem and ultimately built something new. The city nominated the building for heritage protection, but never followed through, and eventually recommended its demolition to improve a sightline. No single institution set out to destroy the McLaughlin Planetarium. Each one simply declined, at the moment it held the building, to be the institution that saved it. And because each one declined, the decision passed to the next, until there was no next. What replaces it is, at least, not nothing. The University of Toronto's Centre for Civilizations, Cultures, and Cities will study the forces that shaped urban life, like how cities grow, how they fail, and how they serve or abandon the people who live in them. A school dedicated to understanding cities will occupy the grounds where Toronto once looked at the stars. At most, it is a more fitting successor than a luxury condominium tower or a private spa. If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Stay tuned for more!